how many U.S. military satellites are there presently, and how many total military satellites are there, world satellites?
Total satellites?
Yes.
Okay. All of them.
Exactly. We all saw the movie Gravity, and there's a lot of junk floating around there in space.
So we'll talk about debris in a second, but to get to your total, I'll say it this way. The exact number of military satellites is classified, but I will tell you that over the next 2 years, the total number of satellites that have been launched since the dawn of the space age is about 4,000.
Okay.
And not all of them are still working.
And that's not just U.S., that's world.
Worldwide.
Okay.
In the next 2 years, we're going to double that number with the number of satellites we're going to launch.
Worldwide.
So, worldwide. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of those are from the U.S. on the commercial side. If you look at the curve, it is exponential on the progress of that curve.
With 4,000 satellites going, well, most of us here live in New York or the tri-state area, and it is congested, the roads and stuff. It's tough even getting over from one lane to another without hitting somebody. You have a lot of, 4,000 is a lot flying around the Earth. How do you prevent satellites, especially from other countries, hitting one another?
So it's 4,000 satellites is a lot more than it used to be, and it's going to get worse. But I will tell you that 73 trillion cubic miles is a lot of space. That's a lot of lanes on the crossing expressway. So while it does sound like a lot, there are some very popular highways that are more congested than others, and then separated by a lot of blank space. Right? I won't name any boroughs here, but the fact of the matter is that one of the most popular orbit and the most useful orbit for a lot of reasons is the geosynchronous orbit. Right? That's the orbit, 20,000 miles up. That's the orbit that is used, that is popular because it is the one where the period of the orbit is exactly the same as the rotation of the Earth. Right? So it's one turn every 24 hours, which means it's always looking down at the exact same spot over the equator. You can imagine that would be very useful because you can stick the satellite dish pointing at that spot from anywhere on and you can see it on the Earth, and you don't have to move that dish. It's essentially stationary from your perspective. So because that's the most popular orbit for communication satellites mostly, DirecTV, anybody here at DirecTV? Right? Okay. XM radio, that kind of thing. Those satellites are registered and slotted, and there's actually international organization, the ITU, International Telecommunication Union, whose job it is to register slots in the geosynchronous orbit, mainly for frequency deconfliction, so we don't have the electromagnetic interference that takes place between satellites in those orbits. And they put them in those slots, and they keep them there. And countries and companies guard them jealously. When they get those slots, they don't want to leave them empty, and somebody else could snap them up. But that's the only orbit where there is any kind of management at all. Everything else, low Earth orbit, that's the place where all the congestion takes place because A, it's closer to the Earth, and B, they're in very popular orbits that are either polar in nature or equatorial in nature, going around this way, which are crowded with everything from the International Space Station to these commercial remote sensing satellites we're talking about, to weather satellites, and everything else that we do, all tends to be in that same set of low Earth orbits. And over time, as that gets more and more populated, and those satellites end their life, if they're maneuverable at end of life, we try to deorbit them, put them down into the atmosphere, and they burn up upon reentry in the atmosphere, so that it can clear it out. But not all of those satellites are disposed of. Sometimes they die before they get a chance to be deorbited. And so what that means is you've got an awful lot of debris up there in low Earth orbit. And that debris will decay over time, but it might take a while. So, for example, back in 2007, the Chinese tested an anti-satellite missile. And they shot down one of their own weather satellites that was out of service. They did it to demonstrate that they had the capability. But in the process, they created an additional 3,000 pieces of debris, i.e. as many satellites as there were at the time, and basically polluted that part of the orbit environment. Now, we have an organization in the Air Force, in the Department of Defense. It's called the JSPOC. It's the Joint Space Operations Center. And they've got officers stand and watch 24/7, and they do nothing but survey the results of those telescopes and radars I talked to you about, to watch for potential conjunctions, intersections between objects in space. And I'm here to tell you that that the debris created by that test, we are still, almost 10 years later, dodging that debris. And we're causing satellites to maneuver to avoid that debris today, even today, 10 years later.